Arvoyarns.
We're living in a post-higher production value podcast world, people.
Got a fancy camera, and this is arvoyarns.
Hey everybody, this is arvoyarns. Thanks for bearing with us during the hiatus. I'm sure a lot of you were really hungry to see this, so here we are again by popular demand.
This one's for you. Yeah. Well, just before the camera started rolling, I was telling a story about the 19th century mathematician Sylvester. Not his original name.
Shocker.
He was in his 20s. He went to the University of Virginia to teach. He was Jewish at a time in Victorian England. They weren't into that. Had trouble getting a job. And ends up in, the colonies or whatever.
So he couldn't get a job in Britain because he was Jewish?
Yeah, well, they didn't even let him take his degree.
Wow. Take his degree?
He completed all the courses, did all the
But they didn't give
tests.
it to him.
They didn't give him his degree.
Wow, in Britain they didn't.
Yeah. I mean, the full arc of his story is kind of great because it's his family moves to Britain in, I guess, the late 1700s.
From where?
From, somewhere in Germany, I think.
Okay.
And, kind of eventually got involved in, Liverpool kind of, society.
Mm-hmm.
And they worked as
you do.
At the time, today we have, agents, literary agents, agents for actors. Well, they had agents for sailors back in the day. People to look after your interest while you're away on the voyage. People to loan you money, because it takes a lot of capital to get those ships going. At the time, the British were doing this thing where they're at war with France, war with various people, and there'd be a bounty. If you attacked and pillaged some enemy ship, got all this treasure, you would turn over part of it to the state, and then you get a prize or whatever. And so these agents would handle that. So they float you some money.
It was just basically if you're a criminal, not to our people,
to the other people. This is early 19th century, high
high pirate times.
Yeah.
Or actually kind of
state-sponsored piracy.
Yeah, state-sponsored piracy.
Yeah, so
fascinating.
I don't know if Britain was unique in this regard or anything.
I would certainly doubt it.
Yeah,
they're the only
likely.
people that came up with that.
So his family, got enough money to eventually move to London. So young Sylvester, got to go to some fancy schools, and ultimately wasn't able to get his degree. So he was bouncing around. He comes to America.
Because they're we don't care about what you know. If you don't have the degree, it doesn't matter.
He was.
Who would have thought?
Yeah, right. Well, it's interesting. He even published some little test, the equivalent of your Cliff Notes or little things for students, something study math. So this is just an interesting.
By the way, this is fascinating parallel, right? I mean, I'm not gonna say I'm too much like Sylvester. I mean, I don't even know anything about this guy really, but I don't have a degree, but I work at a software company. I had to do sales, and I've been tremendously successful at it, but it's funny because there's a lot of companies that just won't even talk to me just because I don't have a degree. And the funny thing is even though I would be a really good employee for them. Now I wouldn't want to ultimately work at a place where they saw me like that. But it's even really fun. It's
have you been rejected to your face? They were you don't have a degree.
On a phone.
Really?
On a phone, I've been rejected on the phone. And what was really
because everyone
funny too,
inflates the qualifications.
I'm not gonna say the company, but they were oh yeah, you seem really great. Oh, you don't have a degree? We can't do it. It's just not in the rules. And then they contacted me a month ago, and they were trying to recruit me. And I was this is the funniest thing ever.
Well, left hand doesn't know what the right hand's doing. So
He's in America.
And you got to picture him, kind of skinny, Jewish kid, speaking a British accent, very proper person.
Matthew.
Well,
Matthew.
So, it's hard I mean, well, I'll say that, like, in my early 20s, I did try to, like, teach college, and I didn't do so bad at it, but, like, it is quite a challenge to, like, figure out how to, like, project, like, some degree of authority, in front of, like, 20, 25
miscreant
people. But I lucked out. All my students were great. Not so lucky was Sylvester, because, he goes to University of Virginia. It's, like, in the South. It's, like, in the 1840s or 50s. Check me on that. I'm not sure exactly. Maybe even, yeah, probably. And so, like, this is a time where, like, if you were, like, a frat boy going to college, like, you would bring your slaves with you. Like, you would be
when
walking
was
around
slavery
campus
abolished?
with your, in the 1860s.
What year?
I mean, the Emancipation Proclamation.
63, right?
63, yeah, maybe. So this is,
Okay,
so well before that.
Here we go. Here we are. Frat boy at college.
They're carrying around their swords.
Jesus Christ.
A train of slaves with them.
Walking around with their swords. That actually got abolished in Japan.
Carrying swords?
Yeah, because I think it was funny because in America people were like, oh yeah, like we're so about having swords, but it was like a status thing as well, right? To like have the sword.
Yeah, sure.
But like people are so obsessed with swords in Japan that during the Meiji Restoration, like at the very beginning of it, one of the things that happened was that the government was like, you can't carry swords anymore. You can't unless you're like doing an official duty, basically. Like it's like the equivalent of like open carry. Like you couldn't have a sword unless you were like literally doing the thing in the act. You couldn't just walk around with a sword anymore because there were just so many motherfuckers from hundreds of years.
Well, you wonder what like coat rooms were like back then. You like leave your coat in your room.
Oh yeah, leave your sword.
Leave your sword there.
Yeah, right. But there were just so many skilled like samurai from literally hundreds of years of that being the norm, that you couldn't just have the equivalent of today of like, imagine if like America had just been through it for like hundreds of years, just gunslingers just constantly killing each other for like this state, that state, this part of Louisiana, that part of like North Jersey's its own state now. Oh, never mind, now it's not. And like you've just got all these fucking skilled gunslingers with like they're just totally allowed to just walk anywhere with their guns. It's not gonna like probably work, especially if you just came from a period where everybody was just killing everybody for like whatever they wanted. Yeah. So they had to stop it.
And you see in this case too, where like
actually because they were so into swords, where in America we didn't go as hard, so you could probably still keep your swords.
And it's interesting to think about how that like interacts with like other kinds of like authority. Like in the case of like, bringing your sword to like university, you know what I mean? Where like the dynamic
like,
between the teachers and the students and everything, it's troubled by that. I mean, so, what happened in the end was like, okay, so there's like this one student in his class who's like always giving it this lip. And finally, like, Sylvester like loses his temper at him and is like, you have no manners, like, da-da-da-da, like starts freaking out. And, in a huff, like this guy, like, the student leaves. And Sylvester, because very, proper guy, like writes up like a whole account of the altercation and submits it to the administration, and the kid, also goes to the administration.
Like a bitch.
And, the crazy thing
has a sword, didn't even use it.
Yeah. Well, actually, so in the intervening time, a couple of days later, some of this student's friends, like, actually roughed up Sylvester, supposedly beat him up a little bit.
Also a weak move.
So the craziest thing is that the administration sided with the student because the student successfully claimed that Sylvester had spoken to him like the way a master speaks to a slave, and this was an insult to his honor, and Sylvester was in the wrong, and Sylvester was just so like flabbergasted by this. Like, he just fucking left. He left the University of Virginia and fled, as one imagines he might do, to New England, and was hanging out, with all the people at Harvard for a bit, where he had some friends. Well, anyway, the story of Sylvester continues. He works as, in his 30s. It's kind of an interesting thing, too, for an insurance company. At the time when, like, insurance
left field
was a new thing. So, I mean, if you were, like, a mathematician and you couldn't get a job, for whatever reason, like, insurance was going to be the thing, because, I mean, they were just, like, developing, different theories of like statistics and like sort of like how do you make a profit like in the insurance business. And there was like a lot of like shady insurance people basically, and the government started to crack down on them.
Wow.
And so Sylvester was like sort of part of a movement
Didn't see
to
that
like
coming.
standardize, like what.
He
how
seems like a
insurance
high
companies works.
ethics guy.
Very much so. Yeah. So the entire time he's like writing math papers, and what's so interesting about it, he's like a fiery poet at heart. He's just constantly very into like language, and he's kind of bombastic and wild. And one of the things he's constantly raging against is people who either like don't cite their sources, or like even if they rediscovered something, they don't go back and look like maybe someone like discovered it earlier.
Yeah.
Because like if you think about this time, mathematics and in general like being like a university professor or like a professional researcher, like these were new things, and so the question was like, how do you actually make money doing it? And so in order to make being a mathematician like a viable enterprise, like you had to keep track of like, well, who fucking proved these things, like who gets credit, because like how else are you going to be able to like put it on your resume?
Because your claims are substantiated off other claims that were substantiated, and there's no like reservoir of like, oh yeah, we can see, here's the record. So you gotta be like,
you have to
basically
keep repeating it in print.
At any time that you cite anything, you'd have to give that reference, which is
because it's not like there's like the internet where you're gonna be able to so easily
shit.
kind of like put together some pieces. So I mean, the irony, of course, is like probably a good move like as far as professionalization goes, but like the irony is that probably one of the reasons that mathematics is so hard to learn for people is that like none of the names mean anything a lot of the time, because everything's just like named after people.
Yeah.
And it dates from this time period, basically, because you had to make a buck. Anyhow,
which is the go with a lot of things, honestly.
Yeah,
So
it wasn't just math. So Sylvester, works in insurance, and then ultimately comes back to America and plays like a key role in the founding of Johns Hopkins University, where he was like big shot there. But then eventually, at the end of his life, triumphantly kind of returns to England, gets a job at I think at Oxford as like a geometry professor or something like that. Because in the intervening time, the entire situation for Jews in Britain had changed. I mean, there was Disraeli, there was like a prime minister who was Jewish, and like all of the things, about like restrictions and like who could get a degree and who could participate, who could be in politics and so forth. All of those had changed in the intervening decades. So by the time he returns in the 1880s, I think, it's a totally different world. Well, none of that is to mention anything about Sylvester's work in mathematics, but perhaps we should.
Well, I want to know if he. I will want to know at some point. We'll have to find out if he actually did anything that was any of his. Obviously, it sounds like it's kind of like he did like a hero's journey, right? Like all these motherfuckers are like, you suck, or like you're in the wrong, but actually he's in the right. I'm just getting wrong, but he's like a high integrity guy, and he's like, I'm just gonna push it on, and you're just like, go Sylvester, go. Like, to speak nothing of the actual work that he's doing, like maybe actually like he's an artist and he just draws like really bad circles or something, just fucking awful.
His poetry will make you smile, His mathematics is serious, but certainly he like was just constantly writing letters to people, like constantly in contact with like mathematicians in Europe and Britain and America, trying to create this sort of like international.
You did this recently with that one code that you were working on. This was interesting.
This was a good example of this spirit is alive today. I was interested in there's a theory of quantum gravity called loop quantum gravity, and one thing that comes up is the fact that like you're interested in defining a polyhedron, figure with multiple facets, and you'd be like, well, how do I know what a polyhedron is? Well, you could say like where the vertices are. Well, it turns out like another way is to look at like all of the
all right. Well, don't go too much into detail.
Well, no, it's just all the directions of the arrows in the directions of the faces and the area of the faces. So you can reconstruct a polyhedron if you know the faces and the directions that the faces are in. And but it's not trivial to reconstruct
so
it.
This is the concave space thing that you were talking to me about.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, that's really interesting. So, yeah, so then
they have to. Yeah, there's this condition that all of those little arrows, like if you multiply the little unit arrow that points directly to the face times the area, the sum of all those has to be 0, which means that the polyhedron is closed.
It's like an interesting thing that Matt was telling me recently. He's like, he was basically you're basically working on this program that basically maps space backwards to how we would normally do it. Like normally you'd be like, oh, here's Pete. He makes up this space from the outside. But instead it's actually the way that the thing moves, and by like the way that it moves, it tracks the thing in space, and then you build the space from the way that the thing is moving inside of it. Is that it? Or is it, no, it's the negative. You watch the space around the thing. We watch the space around me to define my actual shape, not the shape itself. Is that was what it was?
Yeah, I mean, you know, like in a broad sense, that's like something
in like a really idiotic,
like
wrong way. That's what it is. But anyway, so you had to.
Well,
you had to reach out to this Italian dude.
Well, he ended up being from. He was Italian, yeah. I mean, I think just from his name, but some guy at like the University of Waterloo, I think, and he was like.
Dude, Waterloo is like one of the biggest coding schools like in the world. They're so recruited.
They have a really good quantum program. So anyway, he just had written a paper where he just tells you how to reconstruct polyhedron from the areas, and the unit normals are called. And it was just a funny moment because like in the paper he was like, I uploaded this like Python code that like does it, and I clicked on the link, but he hadn't actually uploaded it. So I emailed him, and he just gave me his code. And it was a beautiful thing. It's just if you ask, you get it. And if people have a shared love of truth, then they generally tend not to be stingy with their stuff. They'll just give it to you.
Yeah, it's true. Well, speaking of insurance companies, I was at a party on Memorial Day, and I was hanging out with this couple there, and they were just super cool. They were talking about how they're like trying to be fully self-sustaining. They want to get a plot of land, kind of like microgrid themselves, hunt all their own food. It seemed really like down to earth, but also progressive, which is something that's not always happening these days. But this dude was wicked funny. I mean, this dude was fucking hilarious. Like one of the funniest people I've ever met. And he would just drop zingers, like really, really dark zingers, like just out of nowhere, like every sentence. He'd be like, man, we were talking about like the people there that had mortgages, that had houses, and they're like, man, like it's actually not that great of a house. It'd kind of be better if like the house would just burn down and collect the insurance money. And he's just like, Jewish lightning. Get some of that Jewish lightning. And it was just like constantly like shit like that he was saying. It was really funny. It was really dark, but it was really witty. But then he's like, look, man, I'm going to do some acid. Do you want to do some acid with me? And I would normally never say yes to something like this. It was a Monday. I worked the next day. It was just a complete stranger, and it was like 5:00 in the afternoon. But I really hit it off with him, and he's like, yeah, do you want to try this acid? It's really pure. And for some reason, I just like totally was like put at ease and was like, I just completely believe this guy. And so I just took some acid with him, and I'll be damned, it was extremely pure, like the most pure acid I've ever had. But as our interactions for the next few hours unfolded, it turned out really, really surprisingly, because he seemed super open-minded and, psychedelic, so there are certain things that are pretty much commonalities when it comes to a lot of people that do psychedelics, right? But he was, like, really racist. Like, extremely racist. Like, he was telling... And the funny thing is that he ultimately made a claim to me where he said, I don't think that... Aboriginal people from like Australia are people. And it was just like, ooh man, you just sunk your ship, because he didn't know that I lived not just in Australia but like at fucking Uluru.
Why did he even bring up them to begin with? Like why
I don't know. But he was like, he didn't think they were people. He was like, he's like, I'm like all for people and stuff, but like I mean, are we really calling them people? Like, maybe it's just better if they don't exist. Like, super fucked shit. So now I'm like, whoa, like, this is seriously heavy. And so, but he was so funny, he was making so many jokes that I was, like, confused for a time. I was like, are you still serious? Like, is the joke still going? And you're just, like, taking it farther than I've literally seen anybody take it before, and now, like, you're just gonna be like, haha, funny, because, like, at this point, like, it's not funny to me. Like, I'm just like, what the fuck? And then, like, also, like, this is so fucked up. And so I have to ask, and he just kept talking about it, and at one point, you know, I called him out, and I had to say something that I've never had to say to anybody. I've thought this before, but I've never had to say it. It was really uncomfortable, but I was happy that I was able to say it. I said to him, look, dude, are you doing this, like, because you think it's funny? Are you doing it because you believe these things? Or is it both, and you also use comedy as a way to do the ultimate take-me-backsy on everything you say if somebody is like, that's an unsubstantiated claim, and then you can't back it up because it's just totally bullshit and based on whatever you want to believe.
Take a joke.
And it was really weird. There was this long silence, and then he's like, he really just said, yeah, I'm pretty much always truthful. So I guess that was his way of not lying, but not saying, yeah, I'm actually, like, a piece of shit, because that's not an easy thing for people to say. And the conversation goes on, and he's like, yeah, I'm like actually a sociopath. And I was like, I believe you. Like, I totally believe you. Like, just as much as I believed that LSD was good, I believe that you're a sociopath. And now I'm just, like, trying to put it all together. Like, okay, so this dude, really cool. We're, like, bonded. He, like, gives me the free acid. Turns out to be really good. Bonding, chilling with his girl. Everything's cool. And then it just starts to unfold, and, like, these layers start to come in. And it's just like, what the fuck? And, dude, and then the scariest part at the end was, he's like, well, if we're not seeing eye to eye on the Aboriginals, then I might as well not even bring up the Holocaust being a lie. We're just not going to be on the same page there. And I was like, yeah, I don't think we're going to be on the same page, man. And, dude, the scariest thing was that his girlfriend...
Yeah, I was going to ask about the girlfriend. Like, what's she talking about the whole time?
Dude, as it got darker, as the conversation got darker, and I guess more truthful in a weird way, she got quieter and quieter. And, but then when he said that, she said, yeah, she, like, looked down, and in the, just, like, it was disgusting. She was like, yeah, I'm a recovering Jew. And I was like, oh my God. There was so much self-hatred. There was so much shame. There was so much, and I realized as soon as she said that, they were married, actually. They've been married for 5 years.
Shit.
And I was like, in that moment, I was like, this guy, like, look, this girl, like, everybody makes choices in life, you know, everybody's responsible to a certain extent, everybody's not. But as soon as she said that, I was like, oh my God, this dude must psychologically torture the fuck out of this woman. And it was just so fucking sad. It was scary as fuck, man.
Wow.
And it ended really interestingly, because basically after that, I was like, I'm going to go to the bathroom. And then they just basically left. And it was funny, because we were the only people on acid at the party.
Wait, where was this again?
At my buddy's place. Actually, not far from you in Fishtown.
Okay.
And we were the only two people on acid at the party. A lot of my friends were like, wow, it's, like, pretty surprising that you didn't, like, you just didn't, like, lose your shit or, like, end up being like, this is just too much, like, because I was on acid. But it was really funny, because ultimately what I realized was that this guy was, like, the exact opposite of me. It was kind of fascinating. It was kind of like, he seemed a lot like me in a lot of ways at first, but then it was like he did so many things that I want to do, or things that I do, but for all the wrong reasons. it was all to like manipulate people, to control people, and like feel more supreme than others, and it was just so fucked. And ultimately, I feel like it was like an angel demon situation. Like, I'm far from, goody two shoes, but like, I really felt like I was like, he was like a demon, and I like banished him with my very presence. He just like fucking like, he couldn't be in the same space as me, like, after that all got revealed, and it was a surreal experience. And the people around me, like, especially when he started talking about the girlfriend, when the girlfriend talked about the Jew shit, man, everybody was like, what the fuck?
Yeah, what?
I mean, that was like death. That was like nuclear blast ground zero.
Yeah, like when I was initially picturing the conversation, I was just picturing it like just the three of you, but like no.
It was one other dude.
Audience.
Me and my buddy, and then the couple, and we were in the back on the deck.
Yeah, I wonder what she meant by that. Like that, because like I can, in my experience,
I don't know. What do you, as a Jew?
There's like a definitely like part of like the Jewish community which, is like kind of politically like conservative and like a little bit like right wing, and it's like reflexive support of Israel and stuff like that, and so you could, definitely rebel against that or something, or like try to rebel against like the way that, the Jewish identity is like misused. I mean, I'm familiar with that, like,
No, I mean, he was talking
but this sounds like something different.
He was talking about like racial identity shit, and I think like what they were talking about was just, rigorously psychologically abusing and torturing this poor woman. It was crazy too, and it was interesting because he was really I know, right? He was really charismatic too. So I was like, ooh, man. I mean, he's really funny. I mean, he was really funny. It was like if he had made the decision. He was like 40, and she was like 30 something, like early 30s, and it was weird because apparently he came from a lot of money, so he didn't really have to do anything with his life. And so he literally worked as a bartender in a bar, and then he just stopped working there, like just stopped showing up one day, and then he just sort of putters around doing whatever, and then she's, it was weird. I mean,
racist shit on the internet.
Yeah, I just
free
never
time,
even I never even encounter people like that. It's just really funny that ultimately the juxtaposition was, I somehow, some way, I ended up getting free acid from like a super racist white supremacist.
Wild.
Of
great story. Yeah.
All the kind of people that I would get it from. Good?
Yeah, let's just do a little clap. Clap, clap, clap.
Hey. Dude. The sit with North Korea was really interesting as far as kind of the pseudo-nuclear talks went, because North Korea not assassinated, they executed all of the brokers in the deal, in the nuclear deal. They assassinated them on like Thursday or Friday by firing squad, and it's just funny how when in a way it kind of parallels what you were talking about earlier about a government paying people to be criminals as long as it's criminals in other places, because it's fortuitous for them. It kind of goes into the same vein of, okay, America's gonna like act like North Korea is like somewhat good, and we're just not gonna like for this brief moment talk about how fucked up they are in so many ways, or at least their government is, for the hope of something to come, right? And then nothing came of it, and then the very people that were at those talks to maybe like get a better future for North Korea, although I think it was pseudo to begin with. I don't think anything was really going to happen. They get executed, and the reason I don't think anything was ever going to happen was because if you look at it from like a geopolitical standpoint, the only way that you can have an oppressive dictatorship like the likes of North Korea, which literally isn't anywhere else in the world now, is if you have nuclear weapons and you could threaten to use them. because then it's like, okay, well, we don't want that level of destruction to happen, and so they basically can't invade. But I mean, it's gonna happen eventually. I mean, where North Korea is gonna fall, and I wonder how it's gonna happen. I could actually see China being the people to invade North Korea. Like if the Kim dynasty gets if there's a coup for the Kim dynasty, I could very well see China invading, because they're basically in this treaty from like Communist Party leaders who don't even, like, a lot of them aren't even alive anymore. Like it was like originally with like Mao and shit. Like Mao was like, yeah, sure, like you're against the Americans and like you're gonna fight with the communists and like support our thing, like all good. And then they did this like weird cult shit, and then it was like, well, it still benefits us to like basically support you, but like Xi Jinping, he's never even been to North Korea. He doesn't even like acknowledge their existence, because it's not, it's kind of just like and it's like a an unconsensual inheritance at this point. I wonder if China will just come in and clean up the mess.
Yeah. Well, you know, in like these situations, like sort of like you're saying, it's like what do you do? You know, like they have some nuclear weapons. Like, do you just wait it out? You know, do you just like assume it's going to fall under its own weight someday?
At some point, right? It will.
You know, I mean, like I guess that was the strategy the Americans sort of pursued in like the Cold War, where you're just like, well, we'll just try to like outspend them. You know, versus like actually going in and making like some kind of armed intervention. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's crazy. Like what you're saying, like the firing squad thing, definitely puts Trump in a weird position, because it's like, how do you even show up at like the next like negotiations like with that kind of like hanging over?
Oh, I don't think it'll ever happen.
People, you know, it's like
oh, I don't remember you from last time. I mean, not that Trump would remember them anyway, but
yeah, it's like it's hard to, yeah. So I don't know. Yeah, you know, North Korea's interesting. I had a friend who visited there. You know, they weren't able to see very much.
Did they go to China and go through China to do one of the tours?
Yeah, maybe that's what it was. I forget exactly how she got permission. Yeah, it was like friend of a friend. They've been living in like Japan. Yeah, the whole area of the world's fascinating, because it's like, you know, South Korea is like amazing.
Have you ever been?
I went out to airport once, and
Never had the pleasure.
I suppose the South Koreans gained my respect simply because at their airport there were like free places to like lie down and like take a nap.
That is
none of this like obsession
underrated.
with like having like fucking chairs everywhere, people sleeping in chairs. Like they actually had a place to lie down.
Just basically you gave the people what you wanted.
Thank you.
What they wanted.
They clearly know what they're doing.
It is really funny how certain cultures will really excel in certain parts of the human condition, which by and large everybody would consider essential. Like laying down is not something that's unique to Asian people, obviously. But as far as culture is concerned, there seems to be some type of perception ingratiated into our culture where it's like, oh, no. We couldn't have lying down in a public place. That would like go against everything in the West. Yeah,
it's weird. Like I'm not sure like where that
I think it has something to do with like progress, because it's like, no, we're not going to lay down. We're going to keep going.
I guess so. I mean, I think about like the decline of like sleeper cars on trains and stuff like that, which they still exist, but certainly like less in general opulent, comfortable than they used to be. But yeah, maybe you're right. I mean, well, also like I guess, you know, in the 20th century, you know, there's like at a certain point like a decline in like, you know, public baths, you know what I mean, for like whatever concerns people had with those.
And that naturally comes with like an infrastructure thing where like the baths are good enough at your house. I mean, there's like that fact where the king, like the richest person in the world, like the most opulent king or queen or head of state or what have you, in the year in 1900, had a lower overall quality of life vastly than somebody that lives today that's middle class or above in America.
Just in terms of hygiene.
Just in terms of hygiene, the knowledge of how to live your life in certain ways that are healthy or not healthy, all of the amenities.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting to imagine like what, the ancient world would have smelled like. I don't know if it would have been bad, but like just people would, like Romans would, clean themselves, with like olive oil, like rub olive oil themselves, like have someone like scrape off the stuff.
That was how
like,
they
there's
did
so
it
many
too.
different. I mean, that's probably not too bad for your skin. It probably might be good for it.
But I mean, even still.
I mean, I think there's like a whole story about like the way that like soap manufacturers and so forth like sold Americans on a particular like sterilized based, sterilization based notion of clean that like probably was not the best, but I was thinking about when I was in New York last weekend, and I saw a great exhibit at the Met, all this art based on The Tale of Genji, which is this great novel, Japanese novel written by Murasaki Shikibu, this lady, and it's amazing work, big book about the most beautiful man in the world, Prince Genji, and lots of things happen.
Was he an actual person?
No, but Murasaki was, and Murasaki is a character
in her own story.
In her own story.
That's really cool.
And she's like, eventually becomes Genji's lover. Well, one of the things about it that's interesting is like they're constantly talking about how everyone smells. It's very smell conscious.
Very smell conscious society.
Like perfumes, like Kaoru, like one of the characters, just describes having like the most distinctive scent. Like everyone's into his like scent. Like this kid smells great. He's going far.
Well, you know how extreme it actually was that when the first the Dutch were the first people to ever get to Japan that were like Westerners, and they didn't wash in that time in Europe because they believed that if you washed, it would like give you evil spirits to actually wash, which is very interesting. But so you would wash like a couple of times a year, but it was actually like considered good the longer you could go without washing. And so these guys are sailors, and they don't wash because of their society, and they show up on the shores of I think it was Kyoto, and as the Japanese people come to meet the Westerners for the first time and have the first engagement, the waft of smells starts to flow and hit the Japanese people, and it's so disorienting to all of them that they're like, oh no, like we won't even talk to you, and they literally forced all of the Dutch people to take baths on the beach right there before they would do anything with the Japanese people. And it's funny because they didn't even speak a common tongue, so they were literally just watch this person be like, oh my god, and just be like bringing over water, like come on, like, and you're just like, oh okay, I guess I need to do this. It's funny that they were able to still achieve that without words.
Yeah, I mean, well, you wonder, like, in general, these, like, colonial encounters, like, how much smell played a role. Another thing I was thinking about, by the way, was that, like, one of the things they had at this Tale of Genji exhibit was... So, I mean, it was, like, a lot of art, like, they had, interesting sort of, like, Buddha statues, like, I think one was, like, from the temple where Murasaki started writing the novel. The book for, essentially 1,000 years or so has been, turned into various kinds of paintings and screens and all sorts of great stuff. But some of the most interesting stuff were these, like a series of games based on the book. So they had like a card game, which apparently my friend Tim informs me, like kids in Japan still play this game basically. It's like cards and like, it's got like half of a poem written on it, and you have to kind of like guess the other half of the poem, kind of slap the card down. I don't know the full details. There was a shell game where you had like match shells. But the most interesting one was a game based on smell, which is like pretty rare for like essentially kind of like a board game kind of thing. I was trying to think of like anything, if we have anything equivalent to it.
Scratch and sniff game.
No. Yeah, it was like based on like basically like identifying by scent like different kinds of like incense, which is like woven into the plot of the novel in various ways. I'm not sure exactly how that connected to it, but so like for example, you get like multiple tries to you pass around like 3 kinds of incense, a couple times. You smell it, and then a 4th kind of incense. You each like get like 1 chance to smell it, and then I guess like blindfold you or something, and you have to identify the smell. So I mean, the very fact that so this is a culture that's like playing these games where these kids, are like have to memorize, all this poetry, but then they're also like these games are like sharpening, making more acute, the sense of smell and the ability to like distinguish different scents, which you got to figure. I mean, besides in some parts of the world there being just like insane accumulations of human stinkitude. At the same time, you get these sort of like highly I don't know exactly what the average Japanese person, like what their relationship to perfume was. I mean, the Tale of Genji is all about like a very rarefied like court culture. Like it's all the nobles.
Oh,
so I mean, they can afford perfumes and and all this stuff. So like I don't know what's really going on in the streets.
One of the always interesting things to me was like, and I mean, at the core of it, it's just, oh, well, I actually have the money in society, whoever you are, whatever society, to do whatever is state of the art. And so I'm going to do everything that's state of the art. But a lot of, especially, I mean, you could argue maybe not so much now, or at least it's different now because it's more like scientifically based, and it definitely is. But like a great example of that running awry was like the nobles in Europe back in the day, because they would be like, oh, well, like we don't want you to like ever be out in the sun, we don't ever want you to like ever exercise, we want you to eat like a diet of like all this like super fuck shit. And they'd be like, oh, like you can afford to have these things which are really expensive to make, and so for that reason, like it must actually be a higher quality of life. I mean, going all the way back, if like a form of medicine in Egypt was to actually eat mummies. They would actually crush up mummies, and then they would give people pills to eat of the mummy. It's like, imagine, that would be really bad, but it was really expensive to do that as well. And so, because imagine the supply chain associated with it. And so, in fact, the nobles were like, oh, man, this great quality of life, I'm eating all this mummy, like, thank God, but actually no. And it's only because, and it's really like the reason that they wanted to do it in the first place was, they thought it would help, but the reason that they thought it would help was because they're like, oh, our entire society is built around mummies and stuff like that, and, etc. And so, just, of course, the further epitomization of this in any and every aspect of my life is also good. It must be. And that's just not the case.
I was thinking about how, like, I think that, there's 2 broad perspectives you can take that. Like, the past, in its weird hygiene, might have something to teach us. On the other hand,
definitely,
there's things that, like, are totally insane that we can all agree on today. But either way, and I don't know, got taken on a case-by-case basis. But I was thinking about, like, I remember reading this book, a really interesting book about the history of, like how, like starting in like the 1700s, like the state, say like the French government, started taking an interest in, public health in a certain way. So, keeping the streets clean, because we just throw in chamber pots full of whatever, in the street. And yeah, like in this era, like people started the state started like force people to clean things up. I just remember there's just such a crazy story, like in this book, just about how you know, there was like some hospital, and they had like a cesspool, you know, underneath of it.
Oh my
and,
god!
Like the school was also like the medical students would like practice on like these cadavers, and then they just like throw the cadavers like in the cesspool. So there's also just like rotting like human bodies.
Holy shit!
And it's just like
well, yeah. I mean,
shit.
even at the turn of the 19th century, or no, it was in the 1800s. Like some American doctor was like, oh wait, because he was like working on cadavers, and then he would give births, and all these women were dying from infections, like, and so he like realized, he's like, oh, actually we shouldn't do that. We should like clean ourselves.
Yeah,
I mean, nobody knew that even back then. It's just so funny how much we take for granted what's considered all natural, but the nature of people themselves isn't aware of what is.
Like, yeah, it makes you think about the limit of like, you know, you might be able to detect that if you like keep collecting data. You're like, wow, you know, 9 times out of 10, the lady dies. You know, I'd like.
That took a long time to figure out.
But you know, once you have a microscope, you know, and you can be like, oh shit, there's like little
shit is getting fucked up.
Bacteria in there, whatever. Yeah. I mean, you know, is the invention of the microscope necessary maybe for that kind of revolution to happen, or I don't know. I mean, it certainly did.
Yeah, right, definitely. History. Well, I mean, you can just see things at scale, so you understand more about, like.
Yeah. Well, you know, it was contested, like whether there even was, you know, stuff that, you know, what would be.
Oh, totally, of course. You know, it's funny when you were bringing up the in the 1700s in Europe.
There was one more detail about that. Like, so that cesspool thing.
Cesspool?
Well, they just, you know, they like had to clean it up. Like they had to like get rid of that cesspool.
How the fuck do you do
that? So they had to like, you know, drain it or like do something. I just remember like reading this. There was like an account of like the people working on it that had been written, and it's just like someone fell in, and
died.
He like survived, but when he like they took him out, he was like in shock, and like. If I remember this correctly, like he was like for the rest of his life, he was like, I could never get that smell out of my nose. Anyway.
Oh my god. Well, if he fell in, it would have just gone all but his sinuses. Yeah, just completely destroyed.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's pretty fucked.
Anyway, go on.
It's funny about the public health thing. I mean, I think it has a lot to do with opportunity cost at the end of the day, right? Because the people in power, as far as people in power are generally concerned, I mean, and it's pretty across the board, I mean, in all human cultures, I mean, you're only going to help people as much as you think that they need help, depending on how much you care, and then how much
free time you have, too,
and how much they want help.
Okay.
Because at the end of the day, like, a lot of people are like, especially people in power, they're like, as long as people aren't complaining, I don't care. Mm-hmm. And this is not common to society today. This is throughout all of history, right? But there comes a point in terms of the opportunity and the money, like or whatever commerce that they're like basically accruing, whether it's a social commerce of being the head of the tribe, or of a more monetary commerce, or a trade-based commerce, or a resource-based commerce, or like a partner sexual-based wealth or commerce and stuff. There's a lot of different ways you can play it, but I think that the reason that it happened in the 1700s was that there was now the industrialization started to happen, so things started to happen on a larger scale, and when things happen on a larger scale, things get more complex, and when things get more complex, you necessarily need to be more skilled to operate in a more complex system. But what does that mean? That means that if you have a populace which is you just constantly don't give a fuck about them, and you like maybe even actively fuck them over and just drain them of everything with literally no care to anything past the current moment of how much you can exploit them. Now, it's not to say that these people weren't exploited starting in the 1700s, because certainly it still happens today to a large degree. It just changes. It's like, oh, okay, if I actually want to get what I want as head of state of X thing, I need to give people this level of quality of life so that, first of all, they're fulfilled enough not to just fucking kill me. Second of all, they actually can perform the task, and there's other things that go down the line after that. But that's like I think that's the basic basis for why.
Well, yeah, you're almost making me think too about like how
one of the reasons why it happened then
Yeah, like, well, I mean, what was like the social function of like being clean? You know, people might have been weirded out by it at first, or like whatever, clean. I mean, my friend was claiming that like the Catholic Church was against it, like as usual, being like, you know, like what, like you care about your body, you know, like fuck that, like.
That's actually a really good point, because that's a really big thing. I mean, you see it today in coding.
It's an afterlife.
People that are engineers in the coding community.
Well,
are oftentimes some of the like
people who do mental work.
Yeah, they have like the least connection to their body, because they're like, well, the domain that I seem to be getting all this ROI in doesn't seem to have almost anything to do with my body, at least from insofar that they can tell. And so they're like, well, I don't really care about my body, and so I'll just have whatever type of body I have as long as my mind is able to perform these other things that I care about.
Yeah, there was a great been watching like a lot of mysteries like on YouTube, like Sherlock Holmes TV show, great mystery show based on Nero Wolfe novels and like a whole bunch of other ones. But there's a great Sherlock Holmes episode where, you know, it's the 1890s and he is asked by some like Bavarian prince or something to like retrieve a photograph of, you know, this actually I think he is the king at this point. The king and he was like 10 years ago, you know, he'd been dating this opera singer, and like anyway, he wants that to be suppressed. So
I was gonna say he was gonna fap to it.
He, well, you know, we'll come back to that. Because what's funny is like Sherlock Holmes at the end of the episode asks for the picture of the woman, and is like, you know, there's like a line where like he's like, Sherlock Holmes like never really had like respect for a woman, you know, just because of like never like matched like the intellectual like acuity that he was like used to or whatever. But like this woman, he would like always refer to her as like his picture, so he would just no doubt mentally jerk off to her, forevermore. But in any case, in this episode, in order to like basically figure out where the photograph is hidden,
forevermore.
Or at least until, you know,
you got bored
he's
and
distracted with his morphine and 7% solution of cocaine. But he, anyway, to make a long story short, he dresses up in all these like disguises in this episode in order to, you know, investigate like where this photograph might be hidden in her house. And, you know, the actor who plays him, Jeremy Brett, is like amazing. So he like totally sells it. Like he's got like, you know, put some like hair here, and he's got kind of like talks different, like governor, you know, he's got like the whole kind of like British like you know, street kind of like accent. And he looks dirty, you know, he looks kind of like fucked up, you know, puts like all this like red stuff, get like a little extra, you know, bit in the cheeks. And, you know, once he's there, like no one notices him. Like people's eyes.
Yeah, nobody cares about him anymore.
Yeah, like literally he's there in front of her house, spying on her. And like in full view of her, you know, like literally then she goes off to get married at this church, like with her husband. And Sherlock Holmes follows, you know, just to keep spying on her. So like he goes into the church, like he still is like dressed up. And he's like in the pew, like trying like not to be seen, but they like need like a witness basically to like complete the wedding. So they invite him up. You know, it's like, you there, you come up. And she's like, me? But like of course like they don't notice that he was like literally like 20 minutes earlier, like in front of their house. Yeah, they're like not really paying attention. So, you know, you wonder about like to what extent, you know, in a very class like stratified society, it's like people start getting too clean, like that might be seen as well, like on the one hand you wonder like to what extent people have like took it the wrong way, be like, oh, it's kind of like uppity person, like putting on airs, you know, like being like too clean. At the same time, it's like Sherlock Holmes' like ability to like become clean and like put his top hat back on that like basically allows him to like exist in this society, you know, because it's by this time, the late 19th century, like being able to be clean seemed to be a marker of like social status and so forth.
Well, it's funny how he used it and it was useful. for him for a minute. It was useful.
Yeah, yeah. Just like adopt.
Like I had a really funny experience with somebody that I worked with in my company, or a company that I worked for, and they were like really high up in the company. And basically, what happened was, you know, it's the first time I met them. You know, they were really, really high up in the company. Like once, like if they really wanted to, like they could dissolve the department I was in, like let alone me. And I was like, hey, like, really nice to meet you. And they like just limp fished my hand. They were turning when they met me, and they didn't even stop to look at me. They just kept their gaze going, just like limp fit and just like, yeah, cool, good to meet you. And they just like couldn't care at all. Like, it was so funny because to them, I was the equivalent of that. I was like this dirty, like, who gives a fuck about you, Pete? Like, you don't matter at all, yo. And
yeah, it's like
it's just so funny.
Not even necessarily like an active like, you know, disgust or whatever. So much as just blindness.
Like, oh yeah, like you're
just
not.
Like you're not even there.
No, like you're not
yeah.
important. Like,
not on the radar.
Yeah. And it's just so funny because, I mean, ultimately, you miss out on value. On the one hand, with your story, if somehow they cared more about people that were poor and disheveled with their lives or something like that, could they have noticed him? Yeah. Now, is that something that they would have done? Probably not. With me, like, would this person have been like, oh, you know what? I'm actually going to, like, interact with them as another human being. Would that have brought any additional value to their life? I mean, who's to say? I mean, I guess, you know, you asked the question in inverse, would it be valuable to, like, see these lower levels of employees, like, in at least engage with them in some type of, I mean, I wouldn't even go so far as to say, like, force you to have a meaningful interaction, but just to have a smoke and mirrors, like, hi, how you doing? type thing. Like, what does that afford a man?
Sure, yeah. It's so true that, I mean, I like, one of the things that I think is so interesting about our time is that clothes and cleanliness still matter a great deal. I mean, it's definitely a way to, like, enter spaces that you just, you know, would not otherwise be able to enter if you, like, are dressed a certain way.
Yeah.
And you carry yourself in a certain fashion. At the same time, though, I feel like we do live in a remarkably democratic time as it comes. Maybe not with hygiene, but, like, at least clothing. You know what I mean? Like, people are so, in a very almost delightful way, dressed down. It used to annoy me more, but now I see it
so
as like
in the past.
Yeah, like when, you know, it's just amazing when, even when you look at like the actual footage they have of like the early 20th century. I mean, like every guy, you know, like in a city, for example,
like every single person.
Yeah, they literally wearing exactly the same things. Like, it's wild.
And I think it speaks back to this is the state of the art, so we must do it. Oh, this is the fanciest we could possibly look, so it must be the best thing that we could possibly do.
Yeah, and
so
well, there's almost like
that becomes the thing.
Dilemma too, because like if you're the only person to like wear like some fancy suit, then like you're gonna like really stick out that like sea of like black and like gray. Whereas
that's how the powdered
now,
wig,
like
that's how
everyone's
powdered wigs
so
got started with the syphilis. The
Wait,
guy.
say that again?
That's how powdered wigs got started. Some English king had syphilis from like fucking heaps of hookers, and he like just like lost all his hair, and he was getting like holes in his head because you get holes in your head from like really bad syphilis. That fucking sucks. But so then everybody was like, whoa, like he's so important in our society, like I want to copy him. And so then that's why people wore wigs for hundreds of years.
That's interesting. I hadn't heard that because I was
it's also the reason why Spanish people talk the way they do, because there was some king that
had a lisp,
had a
maybe.
Lisp.
Yeah, I've heard that. Yeah, it's quite possible. The wig thing, yeah, I'd like to know more about that. I was like, you know, because yeah, people really did wear wigs in different ways. You know, sometimes powdered, sometimes not, over, you know, really long span of time. And yeah, I'd like to know more about it. What's interesting about the wig is that it's like, I mean, all these things are like a bar for entry. You know what I mean? It costs a certain amount, like have a hat, have a wig, have a, you know, whatever. At the same time, though, there's something interestingly like democratizing about the wig, because I mean, not just like, okay, if you're balding or something, you can cover that up, but especially the obsession with like the gray wigs or the powdered wigs that like make you look like you're old. Like, so much of the authority of like, I mean to this day, I mean, I think like in the UK, like judges have the wigs and stuff. So like, you know, imagine to bring it back to young Sylvester, you know, at the University of Virginia in his like late 20s, trying to like gain the respect of these like slave owning frat boys. And you're like, but like if he had like a cool wig on,
if he had a sword,
and he had, you know, and he had a sword, then
a slave.
You wonder, just because, you know, it gives you like a little bit of a look at like, you know.
Well, here's
authority. I have gray hair. I'm like an old person.
Here's
like,
a great parallel.
Ignore the smooth face.
Ended on in modern day. My brother went to UPenn. He was telling me about some of the frats there, and he said that one of the frats, I think it's the most expensive frat to join for like Chinese people. Like everybody's Chinese in the frat. You have to break a Rolex. You have to break a Rolex.
Anyway, like, any way you want?
I don't know, but you have to buy a Rolex. You have to break it. And I think the minimum a Rolex goes for is $6,000.
Really?
Yeah. So
do they keep like the shattered remains of all the?
Probably. They're like, yeah, nice.
But this is like the actual question. Rolex is the plural. Roleces.
What is what's a
Is it Rolexes or is it Roleces?
I don't know. We're not gonna be able to see you anymore, Matt. It cuts at the waist. I don't know. That'll be an
like vertex and vertices.
That'll be a question.
Matrix and matrices.
That'll be a question for another time. We'll
thanks
for
follow
listening. Up on that. You'll have something to look forward to. The plural of Rolex. It's just Rolexes, dude.
Write in. Let us know in the comments.